Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we have part two of our special interview with Dr. David Wurmser, who was the Middle Eastern foreign policy advisor to Dick Cheney in the George W. Bush administration. Warm welcome to the program, and today's guest is all the way from the States. He is Dr. David Wurmser. David, absolute pleasure to be able to have this opportunity to record a second interview with you with your experience of serving in the G.W. Bush administration together with President Trump, and it's an absolute pleasure to host you today.
Thank you, Simon, and it is such a great pleasure to be on with a friend, long-term friend, and just wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Pleasure. And David, we talked about your involvement working for Dick Cheney, then US Vice President, in the White House, and really becoming the architect of so much of George W. Bush's policies towards the Middle East, especially to Iraq. But before we discuss more in detail about that role and also what led up to the invasion of Iraq back in 2003, it's important to get Iraq in context, isn't it? That when we saw that Saddam Hussein came to power in a coup d'etat, and he was an ally of the West primarily because of the threat from the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Can you just take it from there and how the West and the CIA backed Saddam in that 8-year war between Iran and Iraq in the 80s?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the United States and Iran were in a very bad way after the 1979 revolution in Iran. And we were looking for structures to try to contain Iran. And Iraq being a very powerful country next to Iran, that was a logical choice. But I think there was also a theoretical sort of backdrop to it, which was essentially that the United States looked at Arab nationalism, especially after the end of the Cold War, but this was already before, as a moderating force of modernization. True, there was Nasser, there were all these problems and so forth, but we basically believed that the Soviet Union had collapsed, or was collapsing, and therefore was no longer a great threat, and that their ally, or their sometime ally, progressive Arab politics under the rubric of Arab nationalism, we thought it to be secular Arab nationalism. It wasn't really, but we looked at it that way. We thought this was a modernizing influence, and we had deep faith that this was just the arc of history toward modernization, and that would eventually lead to a general reconciliation with the West. So deep down, we believed that Saddam Hussein, with all his grisly characteristics, was still a modernizing force, and therefore ultimately capable of being dealt with rationally. And so this led us to, I think, underestimate the danger of Saddam Hussein and then use him too heavily as a crutch against the Iranian regime. So that was the fundamental framework. By the way, it's the same framework that allows us to continually think that Yasser Arafat, or the PLO, is a proper counterweight to the Hamas and to the Islamic Jihad. This basic idea that Arab nationalism is secular and modernizing is flawed, and it's wrong. And that's what led us ultimately to look at the Iraqi regime under Saddam Hussein as something more benign on some level than the Iranian regime. The second part of it, of course, was that if there was a grisly demeanor to the government, we could blame it on the single person of Saddam Hussein rather than the essence of Baathism. This was the particular secular Arab nationalist ideology that informed the Iraqi regime. So we thought, oh, well, if Saddam is not acceptable, if he's grisly, then we could have some form of Baathism without Saddam. This is like communism with a human face, so to speak. So that was the framework of why we basically supported Saddam Hussein against Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war.
And David, can you tell us how important and how vital the Israeli airstrike on Osrink was in 1982 that actually pushed back Saddam Hussein's nuclear ambitions? And had the Gulf War took place in 1990 with Saddam Hussein actually having nuclear weapons, what kind of foe would the United States and the coalition forces have faced?
Well, there would be two dangers that would emerge from this. One was one needs to look no further than Vice President Chaney. In the first Iraq War, he was defense minister. He wasn't vice president, and or the Secretary of Defense, and he looked over the nuclear file from that war, and what he concluded was that Saddam Hussein was dangerously close to a nuclear weapon. The IAEA also concluded that. And he publicly thanked the Israelis because we would have faced a nuclearized Iraq within a few years had the United States not, had Israel not attacked Iraq in I believe it was 1981. So Israel really spared the West the dangerous question of Saddam Hussein with nuclear weapons, which, given that this was a man who already, without much reflection, used gas to kill hundreds of thousands of his own population, this was a man who made it clear that he would use any weapons he needed to or wanted to against others. That was that made that such a dangerous prospect. The second big danger out of it, other than Saddam directly, was Iran, because you couldn't then very credibly argue that Iran has a nefarious purpose in developing a nuclear weapon if they're facing Iraq with a nuclear weapon, because Iraq, after all, attacked them, and Iraq, after all, was bombing their cities day in, day out with missiles. So and then you knew that this was an Arab nationalist government, which was essentially cover for Sunni nationalism, and the Iranian government was Shiite. So the Shiites, it fell back on a deep millennia-old Shiite angst about the Sunnis and what they would do to them. So I think that you would have seen an aggressively fast and indulged nuclear program in Iran. And I can imagine in the West, we would have had big debates over the stabilization that this could cause. I remember sitting one day in a congressional hearing, and there were a number of policymakers, very senior policymakers, very respected policymakers. This was 1986, 1987, and they were arguing credibly that we really ought to let Iran and Iraq get nuclear weapons, because then the sobriety that comes in would be akin to what happened to the Soviet Union and the United States. And we could essentially establish a deterrent regime, which would become stabilizing. So there were voices, strong voices already without nuclear weapons in those two countries, arguing for a rational structure of stabilization with the nuclearization of both. So one can only imagine how the debate would have gone had Iraq gotten the nuclear bomb or gotten very close to a nuclear bomb in a way that there was a clear path left. We would have seen an Iranian nuclearization and everything that goes with it.
And David, forward a few years, and in August of 1990, we see that Saddam's forces invaded Kuwait and occupied Kuwait, which led to probably the biggest international coalition gathered in the Middle East to actually remove Saddam's forces from Kuwait. And then, of course, we saw Operation Desert Storm launched in February of 1991 with total success, a total victory for the US forces and coalition forces involved. But do you think it was a mistake not to actually damage the the Iraqi revolutionary forces that Saddam had when he actually pulled back further into Iraq? Or do you think that it was the right decision just to liberate Kuwait and then pull US forces and coalition forces out?
No, I think it was an unfinished business. I think there was not an appreciation that you will never contain Saddam, that he will never allow his cage to be locked. So, and we gave him the forces that were essentially the means to maintain that power through not destroying entirely the Iraqi Revolutionary Guard. I remember there was some degree of sympathy because we were bombing from the air, and it was a grisly sight to see these columns of burnt out vehicles, mass slaughter, and it seemed, quote, unfair. And that was part of the decision to pull back. But one has to remember, as bad as these forces were destroyed and as ugly as that looked, one really has to climb into the daily life of Kuwaitis under the Iraqi occupation in '91. And one realizes how grisly these people were. This is essentially taking pity on one of the worst and most nefarious, really sadistic forces on the face of the earth. And their destruction was nothing but good. And the Kuwaitis will tell you that you cannot imagine the stories. If even to this day you go to Kuwait, you hear these stories. It was horrific what was going on there, and these were the executioners of that horror. So by sparing them, we promise the horror will continue, and that's what we saw at the end of the war, is the slaughter of the Shiites in the south of Iraq, which caused itself great trouble geostrategically, but was also a humanitarian tragedy, thousands of times worse than what we inflicted on the Iraqi Revolutionary Guard. It was a very bad move, and not a humane move. And again, made out of sympathy and a feeling of humanity, actually laid the groundwork for tremendous human suffering, death, and torture.
And David, so if we move forward on to March and April of 2003, and prior to that, we know that Saddam Hussein was breaching so many UN resolutions. I think that even President Clinton and Tony Blair launched Operation Desert Fox in 1998 to kind of push back Saddam Hussein's belligerency against the UN and against his own people, and this whole issue. So it really takes us to the point. What was the key decision or behind the need to remove Saddam Hussein from power and hopefully set up a democratic, free Iraq that would be free of his totalitarian regime?
Well, it was a complex decision, and it was, I think, unlike what some of the articles or movies portray. I actually think George Bush had an open mind heading into the war, in the sense that he had certain things that concerned him. Clearly, there was a personal aspect. He thought his father had not finished the job, but on top of it all, Saddam tried to kill his father in the mid 90s. So there was a personal aspect to it. There was a geostrategic aspect that motivated some of the policymakers, those that one would generally call neoconservatives, that they saw really a larger threat from Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, and North Korea, by the way, and that after 9/11, the indulgence of these governments that trafficked in terrorism and were in a perpetual state of war with the West and actively doing so, that we couldn't tolerate them anymore, and that there was really a change that had to happen, and that the fundamental nature of their regimes being so brutal and being so dictatorial could have opened the door for some sort of a basic change in Arab politics that we saw maybe parallel to what happened in Eastern Europe. Many of the neoconservatives were deeply involved in the Cold War, deeply involved with the dissident movements and the freedom movements in Eastern Europe in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 80s, sorry, and they were convinced that there was a different way, and that you could somehow transplant what happened in Eastern Europe to the Middle East if you just lifted the veil of horror, the veil of death and destruction that was being imposed on these various populations. So the worst populations were the most likely to have some sort of an appreciation for freedom. So there was this deep sense that there was a larger question among the neoconservatives of changing the nature of Arab politics. And then there was the final aspect, which was that sanctions were not static. They were beginning to crumble. We had this idea of smart sanctions, which was nothing more than a nice way to say, we can't hold all the sanctions in place, so we're going to try to save what we can. But the problem was, once in retreat, you were in a rout. So sanctions were beginning to crumble. You could see it in 1990, 2000, 2001, 1999, 1998. There was really a serious breakdown in the sanctions regime. So it wasn't that Saddam had a nuclear weapons program or had a weapons of mass destruction program or was rearmed. It was the potential that a man of this ilk would rearm and was preparing breakout, but didn't yet have these programs. So the idea was, since he was violating the 1991 ceasefire, and he was violating it from already the standpoint of human rights, the way that he was crushing the Shiites in the south, his destruction of the Shiites, his use of chemical weapons against his own population was a violation of the ceasefire agreement of 1991. So the authorization to war was already there. We didn't need the weapons of mass destruction violations to authorize going to war, even on the UN level. We didn't need it. But at any rate, there was this feeling that he will develop these weapons programs if the sanctions crumble. So the idea was better to deal with him now than to deal with him later once he has these programs. Unfortunately, internal to the US government, there were strong forces that opposed the war, including the British government, by the way. And the two worked together. The internal forces in the US government, the British government, basically argued that you needed another UN violation. You needed a violation of the weapons clauses, and you needed to prove that he had weapons of mass destruction to go to war. They thought that that would derail it because we would fail at the UN and so forth, and that would stop President Bush from proceeding. But Bush was determined to hold Iran to its obligations on every level: sanctions, human rights, and any weapons programs. And as a result, he basically told the UN in a famous speech, I believe it was January 2003, that the UN is on trial. Whether it'll go to the League of Nations and be proven ineffective or not is the UN's choice. But the UN is on trial, not us. So essentially, there was this shift that happened, led by the opponents of the war, to make it all dependent on proving that Iran already had an active arsenal of weapons. But that was never the calculation that informed the neoconservatives, Bush himself, or those who were in another capacity believed in a fundamental danger of Saddam and the opportunity that came with it of having some sort of a fundamental shift in Arab politics. So that was really the essence of the decision-making camps in the wars. There was a deeper fissure after 9/11 that was a backdrop to this, which was when you have 3,000 dead Americans in a surprise attack in the middle of the late summer, September. You look at what was the politics, the background politics that led to this, because this wasn't the first attack. This was the worst attack, but not the first. We had seen this crescendo over 20, 30, 40 years of the overflow of violence and terrorism from the Middle East into the West and Western capitals, international air traffic. For those of us who are old enough to remember, you could walk on a plane in 1968, 67. It wasn't a big deal. It was like getting on a bus. This is a result of the sort of terrorism that overflowed from the Middle East. And there was a deep sense that this sort of violence was a mechanism that was legitimately used by various Arab governments. In their terms, was legitimately used. And other Arab governments, being under threat from these very dangerous governments, would pay the dues. Essentially, they would literally make deals with these terrorist organizations like Yasser Arafat, saying, listen, we won't bother you if you don't bother us, and we'll even pay you some blood money to keep you from attacking us. So there was this real dangerous structure of tolerance of terrorism that ultimately emerged from the violent nature of Arab nationalist politics, and then afterwards, Muslim Brotherhood-based politics. So there was a feeling that until you address that underlying malaise of politics, you will never address this underlying malaise of terrorism. And by the way, the refugee flows that were already beginning. We already saw that then too, that this was a consequence of that. Essentially, the Arab world was exporting its internal violence, which was getting worse and worse and worse. And until we dealt with the politics that fed that fueled that, nourished that, we were never going to deal with the terrorist threat, and it was going to become increasingly dangerous.
David, I just want to draw, you mentioned earlier just then about the weapons of mass destruction. Now, in this country, our then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, sold the whole entire war and the commitment of British troops in this endeavor on the whole issue of weapons of mass destruction, came up with a dodgy dossier, as we all know, which does make me think, did President Bush have an effective media and PR campaign to explain the main reasons why US forces went into Iraq, or did it just become blurred by the kind of chaos of war?
No, he didn't have an effective structure. And I think it was partly because, again, the weapons of mass destruction argument was primarily pushed by the opponents of the war, because they didn't think that there would be a UN resolution that would reauthorize the use of war. So they thought this was a sure path to blocking the United States from going to war. So, and then afterwards, Colin Powell, specifically Richard Armitage, the Deputy Secretary of State, realized that they were on the great odds with the president, because that's not how the president looked at it. And frightened of their position, they then tried to prove that there were weapons of mass destruction programs that were active and building in a great way. So the irony of all this is that the opponents of the war were the ones who hinged the war, that made the war, or made as a prerequisite for the war, the existence of these weapons of mass destruction programs. The advocates of the war had these geostrategic, moral, historical concepts, and also the terrorist question, which we believed was an overflow of the politics of the brutality. So we didn't believe that you needed to prove a weapons of mass destruction program. And what we showed, there was a dangerous government that still had aspirations for such a program. It was better to deal with them now than later. The opponents were the ones who focused on that. And I think it was a tough road. Now, to be fair, Saddam was in violation of these agreements, and he was in violation of these agreements, these ceasefire agreements, because he was thinking that he would eventually resurrect all these programs, and he was trying to keep whatever assets he still had. The fact of the matter was there were thousands of chemical tipped shells that disappeared, and he never accounted for. And then he said, well, I just destroyed them and I didn't keep records. That was one of the issues that the Colin Powell and others raised. And for the first years, it didn't look very good. I mean, we didn't see them. But I think one has to begin to realize that toward the end of the Bush administration, 2006, 7, 8, they found almost all those shells. They were buried in safekeeping. Now, some said, well, let it go. Don't talk about it. Let sleeping dogs lie. The debate over weapons of mass destruction had been lost. And these weapons, probably Saddam, just that's how he destroyed them. He buried them. I don't buy that for a moment. He knew exactly where they were. They were in a military base. He knew exactly how to bury them. And they were usable because they were used. They were used in the Syrian campaign against us. They were used in Iraq against our soldiers. We had soldiers that were attacked by these shells that were used as improvised explosives now by ISIS. They were out there. The second thing was the various post-war reports made it very clear and validated the idea that Saddam was protecting and trying to keep intact as much of his programs as he could in order to ensure that his programs could be resurrected very quickly when sanctions collapsed. So there were documents, there were programs, there were industrial assets that were in place. And all these post-war investigations all concluded the same thing, that he was intending on a breakout and he was trying to preserve what he could for that breakout. But no, he had not had the ability to have an active full tilt nuclear weapons program or an active full tilt chemical program. He just had the pieces in place and trying to increasingly get more pieces in place. So that's the nature of the weapons of mass destruction issue.
Yeah, I really appreciate you clearing that up. But we also saw that the actual military attack by US and coalition forces against Saddam Hussein and the Republican Guard was incredibly successful. 2 months to overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. And then, of course, we saw that historic centerpiece of the war when we saw Saddam Hussein's statue being pulled down. Was caught by the world's media, which was an incredible relief for the Iraqi people themselves and symbolized a freedom. But from there, where did it go wrong? Because Saddam Hussein was defeated; he was on the run. Many of his sons were actually killed in that operation, and then we have this almost a full-scale Islamist insurgency against British, US and coalition forces in Iraq?
Well, I think that the insurgency wasn't indigenous. The insurgency was externally imposed. Again, the roots of this lie long before the Iraq War in Syria and Iran. In 1996, Saddam Hussein's relative Hussein Kamal defected to Jordan. It showed that the regime was beginning to have serious problems with the Sunni core of the regime, the tribes specifically. And in the years that ensued, you saw some great dangers to the Saddam regime from those tribes, the core tribes like the Dulaim tribe and so forth in eastern Iraq and western Iraq. And Hussein Kamal in Jordan thought perhaps that he could organize those tribes to threaten Saddam Hussein. For whatever reason, I don't to this day understand why he went back to Iraq and was promptly, brutally tortured and executed and publicly displayed his body by Saddam Hussein. I still don't understand why he went back. But the truth was there was a structure of Sunni tribal opposition to Saddam that had emerged under him. And the Syrians, understanding that Saddam's days were somewhat numbered back in 96, 97, 98, there was this feeling that in Iraq and in Syria and in Iran, that there was a great opportunity. So they tried to bring the Iraqi tribes under their control, these Iraqi Sunni tribes under their control. And they created a league of opposition. It didn't really get anywhere. But where it became very useful was after the war and after the liberation of Iraq. You had a situation where the Sunnis were nervous because we had overthrown a Sunni regime, essentially. Arab nationalism was a cover for Sunni nationalism over the Iraqi Shiites, as well as Arab over the Iraqi Kurds. So you had a situation where you had very great nervousness among the Sunnis that we were cover for a Shiite domination. Rather than allay those fears, Iran and Syria understood that this was a great opportunity. The Shiites were nervous that we were going to, because our entire foreign policy establishment had spent the entire existence of engagement in the Middle East, seeing the Middle East through a Sunni narrative. And we were clearly wishing there was some sort of an Arab nationalist government in Iraq, even after Saddam, and even after we had removed Saddam, there was still this idea that we needed some sort of a Baathism Light or Arab nationalism light, which the Shiites still saw as cover for Sunni domination. So there was this real sense of fear among the Sunnis and fear among the Shiites. And Iran decided to launch this internal war inside with Syria against the Iraqi people itself, ironically supporting the Sunni tribes to attack Shiites, and then the Shiites militias that were aligned with Iran to attack Sunnis. And this created this civil war and this climate of instability, and both communities would be retreating into their safe structures. One was ISIS, or at the time it was still Al-Qaeda Iraq. ISIS emerged from a slightly different structure that's even more dominated by the Syrians, by the way, in Nahar al-Barid in Lebanon. But at any rate, the Sunnis in Western Iraq sought refuge from the Syrian tribe structure that Syria had created, and the Shiites increasingly under Muqtada al-Sadr, which was the leader of sort of carrying water for the Iranians in southern Iraq. And what was the purpose of all that was to drive the Shiites into seeking protection from Iran and the Sunnis from Syria. And that undermined the United States' position there. And the civil war was unwinnable under those circumstances. The danger was that the British government and a number of people in the American government increasingly saw the only way to stabilize the civil war was to come to terms with Iran. They believed that Shiites in Iraq were essentially simply an extension of Iran. They didn't understand fissures within Shiism. And they wrote off the Shiites of Iraq as an agent of Iran. And therefore, they saw the only way to quiet this civil war was to further empower Iran and to ensure that Iran did not feel threatened. So there was definitely this feeling that Iran would deliver the Shiites of the South in terms of quiet and accommodation if we would reach out to Iran. So therein lies the beginning of the nuclear negotiations with Iran. It was much more to do with Iraq than it was actually the nuclear program in Iran at the time. It had to do with trying to convince the Iranians that we were not their enemy, and that we could come to terms with them and come to an understanding, and that this would then eventually also cover southern Iraq, stabilize it, and then we could leave. We could essentially declare victory and go home. The Iranians, of course, understood this was weakness, and they just upped the ante. And they attacked us even more, and they used these structures to attack us even more. And the war really spun out of control until some very clever intelligence operatives working with tribes and tribal leaders in Western Iraq began to understand that and managed to wrench the tribes away from the control of this structure that Syria had set up that was rapidly becoming an Al-Qaeda structure, and then later an ISIS, what became an ISIS structure.
And David, can you talk through the decision to have parliamentary elections and presidential elections in Iraq, and how the Iranians exploited this and used this? And we saw that real shift in the Middle East for the first time from a Sunni-dominated region to a Shia-dominated region, as Iran extended her tentacles right into Iraq and effectively turned Iraq into a de facto controlled state by the Iranian regime.
Yeah, well, one of the big problems that emerged in the post-war circumstance was that the foreign policy establishment in the United States and in Europe, they created what was really much more of a heavy-footed heavy-footed occupation of Iraq. And to disengage from that occupation, what was almost sort of like a colonial occupation of Iraq, to disengage from that, there was a feeling that you had to find that powerful centralized Iraqi government that could deliver what you want. And so the attempt constantly was to create a unified Iraqi government under a unified Iraqi state that had significant power over Iraq to deliver what we needed out of Iraq so that we could leave. What was the problem there was that Iraq, this was what had gone wrong in the Middle East for the last 75 years. These states were not real. These states were based on very dangerous foundations. The institutions were not actually controllable institutions because there was no real authority of the state. These were structures of power that were dominated by one ethnic group or another and used the power of the state for ethnic control. So what you saw was a brief circumstance where freedom, if it was really to be pursued, wasn't going to be pursued by direct democracy that way. It was to be pursued by diffusing power to the Kurds, diffusing power to the Shiites, diffusing power to the Sunnis, having essentially strong regional governments, maybe even confederal arrangements, and having a very weak parliament. That the real power lay in those three in an autonomous way. And then the Iraqi government would be an overlay. And you could even divide that up into two structures, one being tribal and one being democratically elected. So the real purpose of Iraq, again, for those who really supported the Iraq war from the beginning and were trying to advocate for it in the late 90s, was to create a model of diffused power that allowed natural forces of society in the Middle East to empower and have a stake in the survival of the system. Instead, what we had was that we became the new Arab nationalists. And then the question became, who controls the state? The Sunnis control the state? Well, then the Shiites feel horribly threatened. The Shiites control the state, the Sunnis are horribly threatened. If the Arabs control the state, the Kurds are horribly threatened. So at the end of the day, this attempt to centralize power had baked into it failure and civil war. It was inevitable that that was going to happen. A similar circumstance now in Syria. Trying to put the whole together is only going to reach quiet if there were massive human rights violations of unspeakable proportions, or alternatively, you diffuse power. And perhaps it would even lead to the breakup of Iraq. It wasn't the aim, but what's the big tragedy if there's a Kurdish state? Or if there was a Shiite state, that wasn't in the realm of what was horrible. What was horrible was essentially what we did try to do, which is to reestablish a centralized authority that had too much power over too many forces of natural power in Arab society.
And can you also share with us how the Iranian regime took advantage of these new strategic dynamics? We know, according to news reports, that the Iranian regime halted its nuclear weapons program in 2003, 2004, in fearing that US and coalition forces would invade Tehran, which then put back their weapons program. But we saw then after that being involved in this insurgency, supporting that insurgency against US and coalition forces, that they finally had their goal, which was to try and create an Islamic crescent that stemmed from Tehran all the way to Damascus in Lebanon. How were the Iranians able to be the winners, as I say, in this conflict and turn that situation around?
Well, if you're going to play chess with a chess master, you should be a master. And the Iranians are really excellent strategists. They're very, very intelligent. And if you're going to play in the same league with the Iranians, you really got to be a good strategist, and you really got to understand the game they're playing. Iran, there's a couple things that one has to realize about Iran and its position in Iraq. And Iranians have blurred this history very, very effectively. But there was, in the mid-70s, the 1970s, there arose in Lebanon Musa al-Sadr, hence known as the Vanished Imam. And he organized Shiite politics in southern Lebanon in what became known as the Shiite Awakening. It was truly the beginning of the end of Arab nationalism and the era of Arab nationalism, and was the rise of Shiite, of more religious politics and Shiite politics. The thing was that it was based more on traditional Shiism. And one has to remember the Iranian Revolution is first and foremost a revolution in Shiism. That it was a tremendously violent and totalitarian, essentially, imagination of Shiite theology that informed the Shiite revolution, the Iranian Revolution. And most Shiites bitterly opposed this. And Shiite communities that were not under Iranian control were therefore a tremendous threat. Added to that, the Shiite community of Lebanon became Shiite, and the Shiite awakening and fathered the Shiite awakening 5-6 years before the Iranian Revolution. So they're the fathers, not the Iranian Revolution. So the authenticity was in the hands of these communities across the Levant, not in Iran. So they had a good deal with Saddam Hussein, though. Saddam Hussein, despite what everybody thinks, the Iranians liked the fact that Saddam Hussein bitterly, utterly crushed the Shiites of Iraq, because if the Shiites of Iraq had a free voice, they would have joined the Shiites of Lebanon in that Shiite awakening, and they would have posed a theological and ideological threat that could have and should have destroyed the Iranian Revolution. The Iranians knew that. So for them, Iraq was both an opportunity, but it was a tremendous threat. If the Iranian regime could not control the Shiites of the South, then that inability to control would spread all the way into Tehran and threaten the regime. So they were hell-bent on bringing down the Shiite leadership of southern Iraq. They killed a few of them, like Khoy. Some of the greatest, grandest Shiite leaders were assassinated by Iranian agents like Khoy and al-Hakim. And then they found one scion of the al-Sadr family, distant cousin, Muqtada al-Sadr, young guy, to serve as their agent. But they couldn't bring it under control still. All these voices of Shiism in southern Iraq were opposed to them. So that is the backdrop why they supported the Sunnis to attack the Shiites. It forced them to seek protection from Iran. It was a desperate attempt to assert ideological control over the Shiites of southern Iraq, which were not cooperating. And therein lies the really serious danger of the West's policy of turning to Tehran to control the Shiites of southern Iraq. We essentially relegated to the Iranian regime the one thing that most threatened them. So now you raise the nuclear program. In 2003, the summer of 2003, here were the Iranians, deeply threatened by the Shiites of southern Iraq, thinking the United States was an agent of the Shiites in Iraq against the Iranian regime. And at the same time, here we were a country that had said any of these category of countries that pursues nuclear weapons is our enemy. Remember, the most dangerous weapons in the hands of the most dangerous, or the most destructive weapons in the hands of the most dangerous leaders. That was President Bush's State of the Union speech. They read the writing on the wall. They thought that the United States was potentially going to undo them, and that we had a regime policy change in Iran, and they felt scared and they didn't think they could survive it. So they very quickly began to remove the danger of an American invasion by backing off their nuclear program for a little while. They looked to North Korea. Ironically, they looked to North Korea to see how we dealt with North Korea. And they read by June of 2003 a sense that we weren't willing to continue war, that we had done what we had gotten, that America went crazy after 9/11 and was rampaging, but that we had gotten it out of our system by going to war in Iraq. They looked to North Korea and our negotiations with North Korea as a sign that we had had enough and that we weren't going further.
Dave, we've got 10 minutes left of the program. I just want to bring two very important questions to you. The first one is, you left your role as the advisor to Dick Cheney in the White House in 2007. Why did you decide to leave then?
The balance of power in the Bush administration had shifted. After the elections, the Vice President Chaney, whose power was really based on the persuasion of good memos and his weekly meetings with the president, was no longer had that sort of an access partly because of the election process itself. He was in a different city all the time than the president campaigning. And Condoleezza Rice essentially asserted herself very much as the strongest power within the U.S. government. Now, in the second term, being Secretary of State, and she left behind her deep ally, Steve Hadley, as the National Security Advisor. She controlled these two very powerful structures, and she was sobered. She's not a bad person, and she's certainly not a bad person. Anybody who knows her knows she's a fairly nice person, but she's also not a very dumb person either. She had quite a bit of experience, but her experience was under the Bush 41 administration. So the Bush 41 crowd, which were allies with Colin Powell, had always been opponents to the war, deeply upset at the neoconservatives, and fissures going all the way back to the Goldwater break in the Republican Party and the Ford versus Reagan split and the Reagan versus Bush split. These fissures in the Republican Party had been there, and she fell under their sway, under this idea that there had been some great maturity and success of the 91 Bush years, President Bush Sr., who is generally referred to as 41. They had this idea they were the adults, and so they asserted themselves in the second term. And the civil war in Iraq, I think, unnerved President Bush. He was deeply disturbed by it. He took very personally the suffering of the Iraqi people, and took extremely personally the body bags that came home from Iraq of American soldiers. And I think he lost will, and he essentially punted and gave in to Condoleezza Rice. And the second term was essentially her term, and the Bush 41 crowd's term. And under those circumstances, I didn't see a point for myself being there.
Well, thank you for giving us that incredible insight. And can you tell us about your role as a special advisor to President Trump on Iran? What was it like to work for President Trump, his administration? Because we can now look back and see that the Middle East and the world has become a far more dangerous place, that he's now no longer occupying the White House.
Yeah, I didn't work directly with President Trump. I didn't actually meet with him even once. My job was to John Bolton. I had been the very senior advisor to John Bolton in the Bush 43 crowd back in the early 2000s. And John wanted me to come into government, and he actually wanted me to be either his deputy national security advisor or some such senior position like that. And I couldn't. I had a lot of personal family reasons. My wife wasn't healthy, so I couldn't undertake a job that is a 24/7 commitment. So I organized with John Bolton to be his personal advisor, or advisor to the National Security Council, which in effect was a personal advisor to the National Security Advisor, Bolton. So I would write memos to John Bolton, and Bolton then would turn them into either NSC memos or direct memos from him to the president and so forth. So that was my role. I had some influence on Libya policy. I had considerable influence, I think, on the issue of the response after the summer of 2000, I believe it was 18, when Iran shot down our drone and so forth. I think I had some contribution to the move to consider a asymmetric response to Iran, which manifested itself eventually with the Soleimani targeted killing. But at any rate, I had that sort of an influence, but I didn't meet with the president. Now, that said, I have to say, having been close to the fire and watching and knowing a lot of these players on the Arab-Israeli issues and the Middle East issues more broadly, I think it's very much underappreciated how much the United States changed the rules in the Middle East, and that those rule changes created an era of unprecedented stability in the last 30 years, number one. And number two, created the groundwork for the peace processes that emerged in late summer of 2020. These are extremely important peace treaties I don't think they're appreciated how important they are. They're more important than the peace treaties in some ways that had been signed 20, 30 years ago, some of which never survived anyway. Because they really represented a fundamental strategic shift in the region that included Israel as part of that strategic shift. And it anchored the West's foundation in the region much more independently. The United States had a much greater power suddenly in the region through this coalition of strategic allies that was being forged without committing more troops. So it was really quite a grand bargain, essentially, that these pro-American forces would band together and take more responsibility, carry more of the water of the defense of Western interests in the region, in exchange for which we would not tether them as much. We would be okay with releasing some of our control of them. And that was not the way American policy had been run since World War II. Our policy since World War II, the State Department's ethos was, don't do anything, we'll do it for you. Just, we need stability. So don't do, whether it's Japan, whether it's Israel, whether it was anybody, it was who was our ally. Sit on your hands. If you have a real big problem, we'll help you take care of it. Don't do things on your own. It destabilizes us and complicates our containment strategy with the Soviet Union. So at the end of the day, this was a fundamental shift in that regard. We asked the Middle Eastern countries to pick up the ball, form their own alliance that was our ally, but in exchange for which we wouldn't be harping on them as much.
And David, I have about 3.5 minutes left of the program. So just want to say, what would you say your legacy was? I mean, it's extraordinary that you served under John Bolton in the State Department. You went on to become the advisor to Dick Cheney, the vice president, advising him on Middle Eastern issues, and then advisor again to John Bolton in President Trump's administration. What would you say was your legacy that you've left behind for future generations?
Well, look, I think that people like Ambassador Friedman, who was Trump's ambassador to Israel, I think people like Jared Kushner and Jason Greenblatt and various people at State Secretary Pompeo, and truly Vice President Pence. These were brilliant minds who, in my view, got it completely right, understood everything quite well. Yes, some of them listened to me, but to claim any legacy there, I think, would be really quite inflated on my part. They were there. I provided them some minor instrumental foundations and knowledge, but they were there, and so the legacy is truly theirs. And that's not, believe me, that's not any degree of humility. I'd be happy to claim some of the legacy of the Bush 43 years. If there's one thing maybe I shifted policy a bit on, it was Libya. But again, I think really you can't underestimate the intellectual power of the people who were involved. Not one can laugh at President Trump, and truly he's not a man of great scholarship. He doesn't really value this deep academic knowledge the way you or I do, but he had good instincts and he picked good people, and people like Chaney, and people like Pence and Pompeo and so forth. These were top-rate minds with top-rate knowledge and even better judgment. So I think you really have to look to them to see who built the legacy from this period, not me.
Yeah, but I think our friend Harold Rhodes would disagree. He describes you as being the best of the best when it comes to being a Middle Eastern analyst.
I just hope all my memos are eventually declassified and everything, and people can decide for themselves. But I'm telling you, I think one really has to credit these leaders.
Well, David, I just want to thank you so much for your time and just really taking us through those incredible historic events from 2003 with the removal of Saddam Hussein and his totalitarian regime and his henchmen. We'd like to say that the world is a safer place, but we know that the world, and particularly the Middle East, is a very dangerous place. But President Trump did try and implement era and a time of stability, but that sadly looks like it's being reversed now by the Democrats. He protected Israel, he protected the Gulf states, and we saw a pushback on the Iranian regime, and you played a major part in that. So on behalf of our viewers, I want to thank you for the role you played in defending freedom, not only for the United States, but for Israel and the people of the Middle East. And it's an absolute pleasure to have had the opportunity to interview today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great honor. Thank you.
And I just want to thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report with Dr. David Wurmser, who was there in helping implement US foreign policy to the Middle East, to actually take down dictators like Saddam Hussein, to push back the Iranian influence in the region. And it's like men like him who have given us the freedoms that we cherish and enjoy today. So I want to thank you for watching this home edition of the Middle East Report.